Well, my story begins when I began stripping. I was pulling in about $1,500 a week. I was 19 years old. I decided to buy a lot of drugs and alcohol with the money. I remember how my fridge was always stocked with beer. The freezer always full of a variety of hard alcohol. There were numerous bongs and pipes always loaded with dank weed, white widow or purple skunk or blueberry weed. I had used cocaine a couple of times previously, but I had never really gotten into it. Now that I had all this spare money, I began purchasing about an 8-ball a day from one of my friends. After about 3 weeks, my dealer/friend cut me off. He told me I needed to take a break. I didn't know what to do. I went next door to ask my next door neighbor Kiki if she had any hookups for coke. She told me not to worry because she had a teener on its way, a teener of crank. I had only tried it once in the past and I remember how I hated the come down. I told her that I would never touch that stuff again. She told me that I didn't have to swallow it or snort it, but crank could be smoked and the come down wasn't as harsh. This made me curious and so I agreed to try it. We melted a line of crank onto a piece of foil and smoked it through a straw. I remember that as soon as I had taken my first hit I was hooked. I started kicking it with a whole different crowd because a lot of my old friends didn't approve of crank. I started hanging out with the guys who got the good crank straight from the cook. I was once again buying at least an 8-ball a day and everyone I was kicking it with was doing the same. For 2 months I slept a total of about 7 days. All my friends, and my roommates tried everything to get me to stop, including doing some themselves just so I wouldn't smoke at all. After about 6 weeks I had gotten really irritable and moody. None of my old friends wanted to hang out with me. The only friends I had left were the ones who did crank. I was no longer stripping because I didn't want to do anything but smoke crank. To get the money to continue my habit, I would go to my parents' house and steal money from their safe and also ask them for hundreds of dollars at a time and say it was for fixing my car or paying rent and bills. The day that I realized I had to stop doing speed was on New Year's Eve 2000. It was about 6 in the afternoon and I had asked my parents for $150, supposedly for the PG&E and phone bill. I had been wired for 5 days. When I arrived at my parents' house I found 2 separate money orders made out to PG&E and Pacific Bell. I freaked out. How could I buy crank with that? I remember blowing up at my parents and making my mom cry. When my dad tried to take my car away and drive it somewhere, I remember screaming and yelling obscenities at the top of my lungs. I jumped on top of 96 Chevy Cavalier Z24 so my dad wouldn't drive it away. My parents live in an upscale neighborhood and I remember all the neighbors outside watching me on top of my car cussing at the top of my lungs at my parents screaming how I needed money to buy drugs. When I finally calmed down I remember looking at myself in the bathroom mirror. I now stood at 5'3" and 99 pounds. I had bags under my eyes and I looked just like a speed addict. I just broke down crying. As I was getting ready to leave, my mom gave me $150 in cash and told me that she loved me. I went home and bought another 8-ball. I remember that I gave my next door neighbor Kiki more than half of it. I went to my friend Jeff's house for a New Year's party, a party with all my old friends, the people who didn't approve of my crank habit. I drank and had a blast with all the people that I loved the most, the people that I had forgotten about and taken for granted while using crank. That night my New Year's resolution was to never do crank again. Just recently, late February and the first week in March of 2000, I met some new people and began hanging out with them. I began doing crank again, but not to the extent of what I was doing before. I just quit again after seeing what my friends turned into. They became totally different people on speed. I saw how it began to ruin their lives, how their personalities changed, and how tweaked out they had become. Before New Year's, a lot of my friends thought I was going to die. They had lost hope. They had never seen anyone hooked on speed as bad as I was. While doing crank with my new friends, I saw one of my friends, Bugsy, tweaked out so bad that it made everyone scared and quit, including him and myself. The scariest thought comes from my friend Casper. He had been around the entire time and he told me that when Bugsy was at his worst it still cannot compare to how bad I had become because of crank.